This afternoon I've come into the garden to do a few jobs with the tomatoes, both outdoors and also in the greenhouse, because I'm growing tomatoes in both places. Now I usually find about once a week I need to check on tomatoes, see how they're growing and what needs to be done with them, because there's little jobs that need to be done quite regularly when you're growing tomatoes. Now, one of the things that people often question about, well, there's a couple of things really. One is pruning. Do you need to prune? Is it a good idea or not a good idea? Is it necessary? Because some people really do believe you must prune. And the second thing is how you train your tomatoes. Now, there are lots of different methods in training. The method that I've use here I've been using over quite a few years now, and I invested in the reinforcement mesh because I find it one of the simplest ways to train tomatoes too. Now, when I'm growing tomatoes outdoors like these, I don't personally prune. The advantage of pruning that I see is twofold. One is with pruning you can increase the amount of large tomatoes that you'll get off a vine. The second is that you're reducing the amount of leaf material, and that can sometimes reduce disease or pest problems. It can also allow for some types of watering. In terms of watering when you're outdoors, of course you have rain, which you cannot avoid the water coming on the leaves when it's raining. That doesn't seem to be a problem unless it's excessively wet. However, I have found that overhead watering outside isn't a good idea. I have used it at times in the past and found a lot more disease occurs with it. So what I use is a weeper hose, which is underneath this straw and allows me to actually water directly to the roots and soak the ground really well with the mulch and straw over it. I have minimum evaporation, and as you can see, they're doing really well. Now, part of that has been some really great weather over November, which we've just finished. It's probably been the warmest November that I personally have ever seen in Tasmania. My wife, who's been here longer than myself, she says that we have had Novembers like this in the past before I was here. But we can quite frequently get some rather cold Novembers. I know a couple of years ago, planted the tomatoes and it got really cold and they didn't do very well. But this year's been great. Now what I'm going to do with these today is show you this really simple method I use for trellising these up, because I don't prune. All I need to do is actually hold them to the trellis. What I do is get a ball of string and tie it onto the mesh. And while you're at it, you can pull out a few weeds, which are actually plants, but they're growing in the wrong place. I don't want potatoes here, I don't want pumpkins here. And then I just weave it in and out. Now, as they grow, I'll probably have to do this, as I say, about once a week, because they'll grow fairly quickly, and that will pull the plant in. Now, when you don't prune, the most important thing with growing tomatoes, in my opinion, is that you keep the fruit off the ground, because fruit that is low and that sits on the ground is fruit that you're likely to have damaged in some way, usually from insect attack. So keeping them off the ground, bringing them up is the big gain. So I can simply go around and weaving through, run up the row. It doesn't take long. And then tie it off at the end. Now some of these are high enough that I can run a second row of string down on the next line, and I'll do that while I'm here. At the same time with these, I'll come around the other side and bring anything that's hanging down this side back in too. And basically keep them going upright and give the fruit support as it grows. An important thing I have found, or just learnt over the years, is to use a natural fibre in terms of string. Because I was using straw as a mulch, I fell for the temptation when I first started to reuse the string from the bales of straw, the baling twine, which is synthetic, as the string to tie up my tomatoes. What I found was that simply created two things. It created a lot of work for me in terms of clean up when the tomatoes had finished, and secondly, it created a pollution problem because they start to break down and you've got this plastic coming into the environment. So I switched to a natural fibre because with a string like this, it is actually going to break down over the season anyway, and by the time the tomatoes are finished, you're actually able to rip this off with your hands. Even if you don't, sitting it over winter, it will break down and rot away. So any that falls into the soil, you don't have to worry about. It's going to compost down. It's certainly the best way. Any natural fibre, cotton, sisal, something like that is going to be the thing to go with. I'll now run through these Roma plants and do the same thing. Outdoors here, I'm growing two types of tomatoes primarily. There's a third variety I've got in here which is experimental to me. But the main one that I'm growing here are Romas, and I grow those for processing, whether it's making sauce or bottling tomatoes. And because we do a fair bit of that, we grow quite a lot. I've got around about 18 Roma plants here, I think. I've also got half a dozen Rouge de Mamandi, which I grow for the table, salad tomatoes, and there will be the smaller ones of those that will also be processed in the sauce. I like that variety because it is very quick. There is some of those that are already showing some fruit. But indoors, I've got other varieties that I'm growing with different methods. Now in the greenhouse here, I'm growing tomatoes using totally different methods to what I use outside. First big difference is that I prune. The reason I prune in here and don't really bother outside is that the conditions are different. In the greenhouse here, it's a lot hotter and there is less airflow. So I don't want too much foliage around that is inhibiting that airflow. Too many leaves will harbour whitefly, which is quite frequently a problem in greenhouses. Also, there's likely to be more fungal diseases occurring. These are suffering a little bit from that, and I'll show you what I do about that in a moment. The pruning I simply do by pinching out the little laterals that come out, ideally when they're really small. Sometimes, of course, the base laterals can grow really quickly, and as I showed in an earlier video this spring, how you can clone your tomatoes or use cuttings. Now, this particular tomato here is one that was shown in an earlier video where I took a base lateral from here and planted it, and you can see now about a month later how rapidly it's growing. It's got flowers on and going really well. When you do take those cuttings and put them in, the first couple of weeks they can look like they're going to die. Don't be disheartened by that, just keep watering them and wait and they will take off. So these were tomatoes. There's 3 here that I bought that were advanced plants, and they are doing really well and going to give the earliest fruit. There's 3 different varieties. There's some Sindel, an improved Apollo, and also a Tommy Toe. Now I see here I've got another base lateral coming up. Now I don't really have anywhere that I want to grow another one of these, so while I could take this and grow another plant, I'm simply going to discard it. At the same time, I'm going to check this plant for any other laterals coming out. And the only one I can see is right here at the top, so I will just pinch that off. Now, this plant has reached this top. There is nowhere further that it can go up, so it's going to have to come over and start hanging down. Alternatively, you could just snip it off and terminate its growth, but I'm quite happy for this to keep going over and see how long it grows and how far it grows. The other job I need to do in here is to take off some of these base leaves. Now, there's a little bit of disease occurring in these lower leaves, and the simplest way for me to deal with that is to simply remove it. So I'm just going to snip those off. Just using a pair of scissors. Secateurs would probably be better. Cleaned up like that. This then has more airflow coming through. Any watering that I do down here low won't be going on leaves. And the plant has quite adequate leaf up high here to actually feed itself and keep on growing. So removing those old leaves isn't a problem. It's actually probably a good thing for the plant. Again, this Apollo needs the same treatment. Nipping these off. Now you can see I've got a little white fly coming around in here, and opening it will help. I also probably need to come back and spray. Now the spray that I have found actually works for the white fly is to mix some white oil with some neem oil, and that's my preferred thing to use for white fly and is quite effective. Now here at the end with this one, this is the Sindel. There's a couple of base laterals which I want to take off, so I'll pull those off, and I might be able to fit another one of these in. I'd like to see how they go, so we'll do another cutting. This one I'm choosing because it's got rootlets on it there. This would grow just as well, but we'll try this one even though it's the smaller. It's got that nice base. And I'll pop this one in amongst the capsicums here, putting it in nice and deep. I think I can fit another tomato plant in here. Now I'll come back and water that in well. Now the fastest and easiest training method in a greenhouse or anywhere that you've got something overhead to work with for tomatoes is to grow them on a string. Now for this I am using the baling twine, recycling that, because it's relatively easy to manage in this situation. The second thing you need is a pin. Now I'm using an irrigation pin. You could use a tent peg or anything that you wanted to make similar to that. And what I do is simply tie it to the pin at the bottom, so that you've got a knot onto that. That's going to hold it into the ground. Find where you're going to position that near the base of the plant. Don't push it in all the way. Leave it out a little bit. I have a metal bar along here that I'm tying them to, but anything that you can create. So you don't have to get it too tight, because you're going to actually tension it by pushing that pin fully into the ground later. So then just push that pin tightly down into the ground. Then should have good tension. So once it's in, it's simply a matter of getting that plant to wind around it. And you're going to progressively wind the plant around it as it grows. Don't force it too much at once, but once you start the process, away it will go. And so it's then simply a matter of coming along every week and doing that little bit of winding on. And a little bit of movement in there is really good for the fertilization and also reducing some of the insect problems. Now in this bed I've got some young plants that are
pineapple tomatoes. And look, all I'm doing with them at this stage, because they're fairly small, is looking for the beginnings of laterals and taking them out while they're really young. If you can take them out really early, it does a lot less damage and the plant will recover better and it will keep the growth coming up. Now, they're still a little bit early to train. Once they get a little bit higher, I'll then be able to either, I'm not sure here, I haven't got the overhead support, though I might be able to create it because that would be the best way. Otherwise, I will put some stakes on them. And a final step with these is to mix some seaweed extract with some water and to water them with that. That little bit of extra mineral nutrition will give them a bit of a boost. So that's just a few thoughts on tomato growing. I hope that they are helpful to you. I really enjoy growing tomatoes. To me, they are one of the most rewarding plants that you can grow. It's one of those essential crops of summer to me, and you can never have too many. So it's great fun to keep creating new plants by taking cuttings, keeping more going. And with a greenhouse like this, it means that you can actually extend your season much later and start a bit earlier as well. And it's also interesting to experiment with varieties that you haven't grown before, like these pineapple tomatoes is something new to me. And they're rather late, they're going to go later into the season, but that's fine here in the greenhouse. I'll be back soon with another video. Thanks for watching.